Well, we are 15 minutes away from 10 o'clock news. It is time to talk technology as we do with Matthew Dickerson. A good morning to you. Nice to have you back in the studio.
It is nice, isn't it, to be able
It's
to
great.
see the face
See
and
people's
actually,
faces. It's
yeah,
fantastic. Not over Zoom or anything like
the
that.
things
but
we
actually,
took for granted during last or before
well, we
last
really
year.
didn't we?
Yeah.
Look, let's talk Facebook because there is a lot to try and understand here. Obviously, last week we saw some unexpected moves from the social media platform when it came to news organisations right across the country. A lot of people swept up in that. We know there's been some movement on this overnight or late yesterday. What have we heard?
Yeah, so I'm assuming that everyone knows about the ban on news sites and
I hope they
it
know.
kind of enveloped a whole range of other things. I mean, Jimmy Barnes had a site banned.
What? I didn't know about Jimmy Barnes.
Some of the sites that were banned were just ridiculous. But I think the public reaction from Facebook was more important to Facebook than the government reaction. The government pulled some advertising, about $10 million worth of advertising they pulled. And it sounds like a bit of schoolyard tit for tat.
Yeah.
But I think in that case, it was actually justified. If you're not going to play ball with us and you're going along negotiating, hopefully in good faith, and then you say, we're just going to pull the rug from underneath you, I think the government was well and truly justified in that. So Facebook finally, I think, just was starting to pick up on a bit of the sentiment from the Australian public, where lots of people in the public were saying, delete Facebook, I'm moving to another social media platform, a whole range of ones. Now, we don't know about the impact on the bottom line for Facebook from businesses across the nation. Sure, the government pulled 10 million. What did businesses do? I know lots of small businesses that might have spent their $20 or $40 boosting a site. They said, I'm not going to boost it. I'll still put things on Facebook, but I'm not going to boost it. So overnight, essentially Facebook has said, okay, we're going to let those news sites go back and we're going to start negotiating with some of the news organisations. Now, words are cheap, so they've said they'll do that. Whether or not they'll unban those news sites quickly, they said that'll take a few days. I find it fascinating, Nick, that they could ban it so quickly, going the other direction. I'm sure they could unban it just as quickly. News sites aren't cached typically, so if they change that, then you would think that they would be responding almost immediately, because I can't see those sites cached for days at a time, because news by its very nature needs to be up to date. So they're going to unban those sites. They said they're going to go back and have some negotiations with news organisations in Australia, and then it's all going to be happy families. But again, those are the words. Let's see the actions that come out of that.
You mentioned $10 million, but I mean, let's be frank here. That's behind the couch cushion change for Facebook, isn't it?
Yeah, you are right. And I think that the bigger implication may well be that if you looked at the nation, if you looked at Australia and said $10 million, whatever, that's not much. Add some businesses in, it starts to add up. And then you start to say, what's the viability of even having Facebook in Australia? Do we care about that? Look, we make money out of Australia, so maybe we should play ball. But then I think they started to think about other governments. The Australian government was leading the world here, which was fantastic. So then they started maybe thinking about, well, what about the American government pulled the advertising? What about if the European government started pulling advertising? Oh, wow, that starts to add up a bit more than $10 million. So maybe the little tiny drip in the ocean of 10 million might have been, an extrapolation of that starts to add up to a few more dollars for them.
Matthew, it's still hard to pass what's actually happened, and what we have heard is that one of the big news orgs, Seven West Media, might be the first people to have actually made a deal with Facebook. But depending on who you ask, this is either a great win for news organisations or Facebook throwing out a tiny little bit of concession and still getting everything they wanted in the end. It's very confusing to see if there's actually a clear winner here at the moment.
Yeah, and in any negotiation, it's okay if there's no clear winner. If both parties walk away and feel like they got a bit dudded, then that's probably not a bad negotiation when it's all said and done.
Fair enough, fair enough. I just, you like to know who's the good guy and who's the bad guy.
Yes, that's right. But I think if the news organisations get some money, obviously they're missing out on huge chunks of advertising dollars. And so if they're getting some money from Facebook, because they're getting, Facebook, let's face it, is getting people to see their platform via the news organisations, which means that they can sell more advertising to other organisations. So if they're getting some money out of that, then some of those news organisations that might have closed down are now viable. I think that's a good first step. How it develops over time, maybe there is a formula they create that says the viewers that you create out of our news platform, then we get some minor percentage of that, or whether it's just a first figure that you come up with and then you can start to look at increasing it over time. But at least it's a step in the right direction rather than just still a standoff.
Did you notice a difference in your Facebook feed?
Oh, look, I actually go straight to the news sources.
Yeah, well, so do I. So do I, and I found that really interesting.
I don't rely on Facebook for my news because I'd rather go straight to the ABC website, for example, and actually look at the news there. Why bother about letting someone else filter or maybe collate for me when I want to go to those various news sites. And probably for me, it's a little bit different because I do focus more on my technology news. So I have particular sites. I've got a bunch of favorites that I click on when I'm looking for technology things, which takes me to all of my preferred websites for those news sites. So I'm probably not your average Facebook scroller and see some news come up. But look, friends of mine certainly said they noticed it. But what's really interesting, and I'm not sure if you want to talk about this in particular this morning, it's a little bit biased about the ABC, but ABC did really well with downloads of the ABC News app. In fact, hit #1 in the App Store downloads, and it's back to #2 now, but hit #1 because the ABC was very proactive. And on the front of the ABC website, it said, hey, missing out on your news? Go to here and download your app. So I thought that was a brilliant move by the ABC.
Look, obviously we were really happy to see that. And I think other news orgs would have been doing very similar stuff. Most of them have their own app now, of course, that can be curating those news feeds that you're really interested in from their particular run of news. I do note that it's been pointed out that today, #1 on the App Store is actually a map where you can drop a pin where you've gone to the toilet if you had to do a serious business. So, today's rooster, tomorrow's feather duster, the full works there. Facebook and Google was the other company people were talking about when it came to these negotiations. And of course, Google has come forward with maybe about $60 million worth of deals is what we're seeing.
And your point might be valid there that $60 million, even for a company like a Google or a Facebook, is still a drop in the ocean. So it's a small amount. But again, for some of those news organisations in Australia, replacing zero revenue with $60 million worth of revenue, and that's not just to one news organisation, but that's a reasonable sum of money for what's been taken away from advertising dollars from those particular organisations. So it's a good start. Is 60 million enough? To be honest, I don't have access to the books of those news organisations to see whether or not that's enough to make them a viable business. But what we do know, in a good, well-functioning democracy, we need news outlets that can scrutinise what organisations, government as well, in any country is doing. So we want news outlets, we want investigative journalists, we want people who are unbiased reporting on what's happening in our country to have a good, well-functioning democracy. So if that means they can employ more news journalists and they can be producing news and investigating things that are happening, to me that's a fantastic win for those news organisations and for Australians.
Well, I think we've still got a little while to find out exactly how it's all going to shake out, but at least we're seeing some movement there. Changing tack entirely. In this country we love our streaming media services, but apparently we don't like paying for them.
It's the same old thing, isn't it? Some things are very popular, but if you've got to pay for them, suddenly they're not so popular.
It changes everything, doesn't it?
That's right. But we are a bunch of freeloaders, apparently. We are up, the stats around maybe as high as 80% of Aussies are now using streaming services, which does make it a hard again for those free-to-air services. Their advertising revenue down. But so those streaming services are very popular. But about half of those people aren't paying. And if you break it down to some of those individual categories in terms of groups of people, the Gen Zers, as you can imagine, are #1 in the moochers of the nation. They're at 75%. So of all the people in the Gen Z category that are watching streaming media, only 25% are actually paying for it themselves. Now, it's not as bad as it sounds, because when you go and subscribe to, say, a Netflix, you can add different subscriptions, and you can say, for example, pay for the 4K subscription that gives you 4 simultaneous screens. So it would be reasonable that if mum and dad are watching at home, one of the kids goes off, moves out of home, goes to uni or whatever, and they say, hey, you've got 4 concurrent services, I'll use one of them, why pay extra money for me? So there's logic in it and common sense in it, but I'm sure they're into their 30s and married and got their own kids and they're still mooching off mum and dad in a lot of those cases. So
this is amazing to me that, we are still using those joint accounts. And although, as you're saying it, and I had completely forgotten this, it's the reverse for me. I'm paying for one of these streaming services, but have a profile set up for my parents so they don't have to. So
and I think that's happened. It is interesting because 75% of Gen Zers, Gen X is 51%, they're not paying for it, 38% of Gen Y, but in the baby boomers, there's 20% of baby boomers that aren't paying for it. And I think that's exactly what you're talking about there, where the kids have gotten onto the subscription service and they've gone to visit mum and dad and they've gone, what are you doing here, mum and dad? You're not watching streaming, we better get you onto one. And so then they're connecting up one of their spare screens for them. So it does work in reverse, but at a much smaller ratio than it works in the first way.
And look, I've got to say I'm not surprised. We used to talk a lot about how if you had one of the big cable packages, you were paying a lot over a month for that. If you were subscribing to every streaming service that's available, if there was something over here that you wanted, some program on a different one that you wanted, you're up for a lot of money each month at the moment.
I've done the numbers, Nick. And
how much?
You're talking, if you just pick the popular ones, the Netflix, the Stan, the Disney Plus, you'd only pay, and the basic service of each one, you'd only pay about $70. But if you said, I'm going to go the premium service, so the 4K subscription, and then you took in all those little niche providers, the KO Sports, all those sort of ones, you'd be up to about $250 a month. So when pay TV was first introduced and it progressed, and it got to the stage where packages were over $100 a month, people were going, oh my gosh, that's a terrible amount of money. But when you start adding up these various subscription services, it's a real challenge to get the right balance somewhere between the $10 for maybe one service and the $250 for absolutely bells and whistles of everything, getting what you want. And that's why those niche services are there. Some people might love their English soccer, so there'll be a subscription service just for English soccer. If you're not interested, don't subscribe to that one. So that's the ability of the streaming services to have those various niche products. Netflix is king of the castle. 69% of us using streaming have got Netflix. Stan is number 2 at 32%, so it's a long way down from Netflix. So Netflix is definitely king of the castle, but lots of those other ones are all fighting for that space. Netflix has been around for a long time, and I love the fact that way back when Netflix, I'm talking about 20 years ago, Netflix offered themselves to be sold to Blockbuster, and the price at the time was $50 million. And Blockbuster laughed at the deal that was being put forward by Netflix, saying, oh, who would ever want streaming services? And $50 million, that's not worth that. And of course, Blockbuster's now gone broke, and Netflix seems to be around and forging ahead with, I think, about 300 million subscribers around the world. So maybe a bad decision by the board of directors from Blockbuster at the time.
What were we saying earlier about roosters and feather dusters?
That's right.
Matthew Dickinson, we'll talk again soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nick.
Matthew Dickinson with our regular tech talk. We're a couple of minutes away from 10 o'clock. Let's get a bit of music. This is Yola, Love All Night, Work All Day.